Hello, I'm Sandra Gilman, Chairman of the American Theatre Wing, with our board president, Doug Leeds. Welcome to today's program, where we will be exploring the role of the artistic director.
We'll be back later to tell you more about the work of the American Theatre Wing. But right now, please join us for another edition of Working in the Theatre.
Artistic directors of not-for-profit theaters occupy a unique place in America's theatrical life. As both artists and administrators, they must not only pursue their own vision and foster a creative environment for other artists, but also balance budgets, raise funds, and even attend to the state of the physical plant. I'm Howard Sherman, Executive Director of the American Theatre Wing. Today we welcome artistic directors from 4 of the country's major institutional theaters. Susan Booth of the Alliance Theater Company in Atlanta, Oskar Eustis from the Public Theater in New York City, Emily Mann of the McCarter Theater in Princeton, and Michael Wilson from the Hartford Stage Company in Connecticut. To begin, I want to ask about the seeming dichotomy in your roles and ask whether it is possible for you to actually pursue your own vision as an artist while at the same time serving the needs of other artists and of an institution.
That's a very good question, and I think it's a struggle that most of us are wrestling with for most of the time that we're artistic directors. I'm a writer and a director, and I think the vision of the whole theater reflects that. We're very, very engaged in a core mission way with the commissioning, development, and producing of new work, both with emerging writers and what we call, the works of master writers. So that's part of the vision. Because I have a fantastic team, I have been able to continue my own writing. Not as much as I'd like, but I'm still doing it. And I direct 2 plays a year, and I find it an incredible privilege to bring on my colleagues to work on their best work in our season along with me. So for me, it's a very good fit. Yes, the short answer is yes, I've been able to keep my artistic vision going on the larger institution and also keep my own work going as an artist. But it took years to balance it to get to that point.
Michael, do you find the balance difficult?
I do at times, yes, of course, but I think that, I think overall though, I think a number of our theaters are actually set up to host and make a home for the artistic director as their central animating artist. And Hartford Stage, I think from the beginning, from when Jacques Cartier founded it around classics and then shortly thereafter new work, has always been a place where they have wanted the artistic director, either as a director or an actor to, because Paul Widener came out of the acting company.
And Mark.
And then of course Mark, yes. Who the whole company's work was centered around his exploration of Shakespeare and Ibsen, and of course you remember those years, Howard. That I feel that that's what our institutional identity has been in many ways about. At the same time, the theaters and Hartford Stage included among those are ever evolving and changing and starting to reflect the greater complexity of our theatrical community. And I think Emily mentioned teamwork. I mean, we have a fantastic team at Hartford Stage that includes a fabulous associate artistic director, Jeremy Cohen, a great dramaturg, Chris Baker, and I think with that we're able to support the work of the both emerging and established artists, playwrights, and directors, and it's an exciting mix. But there are times when you have to step back and say, this is a project I would like to do for me as an artist, and when you look back at the whole program of plays, you realize I can't do that because we're not going to be able to afford X, Y, and Z. So you sometimes will make what you might call a sacrificial choice for your own self in order to balance, say, the repertoire of that given year. But overall, I would agree with Emily. I think it's actually what our theater is looking for.
And Susan, you were working as a literary manager at the Goodman immediately prior to becoming the artistic director at the Alliance. And of course, you were freelancing. You were trying to do other productions. So getting into your own theater, you are the newest of the artistic directors on the panel, but it's been 6 years. that adjustment of coming into a place, and on the one hand, having your own playground, on the other hand, having to
initially
be
you
responsible
can
for the institution.
Fool yourself into being drunk with power and thinking, now I get to be Bob Falls, which I'm not yet, and I keep waiting. It was an interesting transition because my job at my last theater was to agitate on behalf of marginalized voices. And I had absolutely no responsibility for the institutional bottom line. And I was in Chicago. And so to transition from that identity to being in Atlanta, Georgia, to being in a somewhat more mainstream audience base, and to have a great deal of responsibility for the bottom line, to make that transition and still have some sense of self-identity that involved the word artist was an interesting period of time. The happy evolution of it is that I've discovered I get a great deal of joy from hosting the party. I'm very happy as a director. I derive great pleasure from the collaborative process in the room. But I truly find the imagining and the hosting of a year-long community-based artistic party kind of a cool exercise. And that activity feeds me as an artist as much as my work in a rehearsal room feeds me.
Now, Oskar, you've been the artistic director of several major institutions. It's your coming towards the end of your second year at the Public. And interestingly, in those first 2 years, you've only directed one show.
I only directed one show, and it was very near the beginning of my tenure, and in retrospect, there are ways I wish I hadn't. The transition for me was really quite sharp because I left Trinity Rep in Providence, Rhode Island, which was a theater very much like Hartford, and the way Michael is describing, it's a theater company that has always derived its primary identity from the artistic work of the artistic director, and that was what the expectation was, and that's what it actually the institution wanted most. It wanted most to carve out its a kind of family identity with the company of actors as the extended family and the artistic director as the head of the family. And that spearhead was what it made for an ongoing community party, but it was very much one that wanted to be led by that. And that was a wonderful environment. Coming to the Public Theater in New York, completely different agenda. And that's the wonderful thing about the Public. The Public serves a specific niche, not only in the New York theater, but I think in the American theater. And that niche is as a crossroads. That the Public is the largest of the downtown theaters. It's the mothership of the experimental and fringe theaters of New York, and it's the smallest and scruffiest and the closest to the people of the mainstream theaters. And what it's supposed to be doing is making all of those artists cross by each other and rub up against each other, and those audiences rub up against each other, bring audiences into the theater that haven't been there before, bring experimental and young and marginalized artists into the mainstream that haven't been there before, take mainstream artists and bring them down and put them in contact with younger. It's that mix. That isn't about the artistic work of the artistic director of the Public. That is about the hosting. That is about the producing. That is about the curating of that place. That's what the Public has always needed, and if I think my analysis was what it particularly needed when I arrived. That's the thing that needs to be most vivified about the Public right now. And what I've discovered is that me being in the rehearsal room is not core to that right now. I like it. And I miss it. It is a problem when I go home at night, and it's one that I discuss with my wife. I miss being in the rehearsal room, but I know that me being in the rehearsal room is not the core thing the Public needs right now. So I have not succeeded in balancing the two. I think I am making progress on doing what my job requires, which is making the Public the lively, rough experiment in theatrical democracy that it needs to be. And I want to say I really identify with exactly what you're saying, Susan. when that works, that's an immensely gratifying artistic feeling. It doesn't feel like, oh, now I'm not being an artist.
Right.
It feels like this is artistry, putting this all together. It's not quite the same as being in the rehearsal room.
Well, let me ask you about another possible dichotomy, but I hear it bubbling up in some of what you're saying. How much does the work you do at your theaters, how much does it have to serve your local community, your specific audiences, and how much does it have to serve the artistic community, the larger theatrical community?
Well, let me speak to that just because that's so much at the heart of what this shift was for me, is that when the reason that I left Rhode Island, Trinity Rep is central to the cultural life of Providence and of Rhode Island in a way that was wonderful and is extremely rare in the American theater. It really is essential to the lifeblood of that community, and it was wonderful feeling like I was running an institution that meant so much to that community. The choice to leave there and come to the public was very much a choice about saying my community is going to be the community of the American theater. And the community that the public ultimately serves is the field as a whole. And that if we don't do what the public is there to do, that's a hole that nobody else can fill. And so I feel, although of course New York is its own Megillah,
Right.
You got his hitters down.
Exactly.
New Yorker now.
All of us Nordic Minnesotans say Megillah. But it really, what it feels like is that the public is really there to be a citizen within America's theatrical community.
So if there's some fall off on that mission, it's not only hurting the public and the New York theater community, it's hurting the national American theater community at large.
No, I think that's right.
true.
I think that's right.
But there is,
Very
I
articulate.
think there is a tension. I mean, I certainly experience it in Atlanta. We take very seriously the fact that we are a national institution, but we have a very local address. And my job is to find a intersection that's satisfying to both the audience and to frankly, my sense of self as an institutional leader and as someone who is very hungry for the field's innovations. So the trick is, what's the vocabulary that's developing in the field that can be adopted to speak to local concerns, local needs? And one of my great hobby horses right now is the assumption that there's a monolithic way to talk about socio-political issues. There isn't. There isn't. Come on down. There isn't. Do you know? The way in which you talk about race, the way in which you talk about gender, the way in which you talk about right-wing, left-wing politics is regionally specific. One may argue that there are national truths, but the language with which we speak those national truths is absolutely regionally specific. And I can have a field-leading conversation, but if nobody's in my audience, then to what end?
It's not just the language too, it's also events that happen in your community. There may be something that happens in Atlanta that would preclude you from doing a certain new play because of recent activity there that it might not be as appropriate, say, as a play that we might host at Hartford. That's happened before. I just think this whole notion about connecting to your audiences and then what is your mission to the larger national theater, something that we talk about a lot, actually.
Oh, absolutely.
Mike Stotz, my managing partner, and I were having a conversation about it earlier this week as we were sitting down with the NEA, in fact. And I think that Oskar is so articulate about the American theater community mission for the public. All of our theaters, they were founded in and for that community first and foremost because they were meant to be, I think, offering the best in classic and new play activity to communities outside of New York. Now, McCarter may be a slightly different story there.
Is. And I think that's a debate within each institution, and that's always different for each one. I mean, we have to remember that theater is in fact local. You've got to be there. It's got to be present tense in the same room with an audience. And so at one level, we're all serving our particular local communities, and like the way the three of you have discussed, even Oskar when he was at Trinity would discuss, we are central to our community. I mean, it is quite a gratifying and good feeling, and yet I don't think our community, it's Princeton, New Jersey, it's an hour from New York, we use almost all New York artists,
Right.
or LA. I mean, we're part of the national theater movement. And the resident theater movement was started to make a real national theater. And we're each and every one of us part of the national theater. Now, how much we actually contribute to the full national theater scene, I think, is different for every theater.
And changes from year to year.
I would not be serving my community if we didn't. I mean, 4 out of 5 of our shows this year are going to be seen in New York.
Right.
We are constantly moving in and out of the city, but we're also moving in and around the theater field. I mean, we have co-produced. I'm hoping that we will as well, and we're sharing a young writer right now, Terrell McCraney, who also was at your theater, but his new national home is his new artistic home is McCarter. Hopefully that means that he'll be going every which way, but we're all part of, I think, the larger whole, and yet each one of us has a particular responsibility, I think, that is different from each other.
And I think this is part of the delicate balance. You
Yeah,
have
it's
to
a
keep an
delicate
eye on
balance.
how your theater is participating and contributing to the national field.
Yeah.
If you're in this leadership role, but at the same time, what is the connection to the community?
That's
I mean,
right.
for example, August Wilson, his home was Yale Repertory Theater.
Absolutely.
And fantastic. Lloyd Richards gave him that home, and almost all of the plays were premiered during that time, except for Radio Golf. James Bundy put that on stage.
And
but
we just opened it last week at McCarter.
Exactly.
So it's all a circuit.
Hartford Stage had never done a play by August Wilson. And of course, Mark wouldn't have produced it because everybody could go down
the
to it.
road.
But the fact is, people in Hartford didn't go down the road. We just did Fences. First time August Wilson had been professionally produced in Hartford. It was a huge event. And there were so many people in our community that play spoke to and resonated with. And that was an important event for our theater to do August Wilson's work in our community, even though on a national field level, Yale had clearly taken care of supporting him in the way that you're supporting Terrell now.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that we're constantly stepping back and trying to balance.
I perceive a tension that exacerbates this, which is that which the national funding community supports and that which the local audience supports are not always the same things. There's a lovely sort of Venn diagram where they sometimes overlap, but there is, I think, a national field aesthetic that says we could go around this table right now and say, who are the top 20 writers in our field right now? And I think there'd be a fair amount of consensus on those names. And those are names that are recognized by a great deal of the national funding community. The local audience may or may not be responsive to the work of those writers. And your decision to bring the work of August Wilson to your audience is a really wonderful, necessary decision. Does the work of August Wilson in a season, how does that play when you're putting your season in front of, I'm editing names of national foundations because I'd like to continue to receive funding from them, but you put a slate of plays in front of a national foundation, and if it feels too familiar, that can
I think
be risky.
Sure, and I think, but that's also part of the balance. You would never want to do a whole slate of plays that were overly familiar. I mean, at the same time, right after Fences, then we were doing the East Coast premiere of Luis Alfado's Breakfast, Lunch, and Dinner, the first production in which she finally had flying and could realize that vision for Minerva transcending her overeating tendencies. And I think, I think that's what's important. If you're going to put an established writer like August front and center, and particularly a revival of a work that's already been identified that way, creating a home for Luis, and I think he needs a home in New York, Oskar, if we can. You can surely help point him somewhere, because you know him from years ago at the Taper, too, I know. But that's exciting to me, and that's mixing it up too, because Luis is obviously not necessarily a new writer, but he's one that has not been around as much as he should.
But let me just flip this, because the dichotomy that I don't quite believe in that we're getting into is that there's the local work that you do for your local audience, and then there's the national significance, because actually Emily's and my relationship was forged more years ago than I care to admit,
Oh, I love that it's so long.
Thank you. 2 generations ago.
I've earned every wrinkle in my face. I'm going to enjoy it.
We began to work on her play Execution of Justice, which I commissioned for my then theater in San Francisco, the Eureka Theater.
Right.
And it is, I think, a perfect example of a play that everything about the genesis of that play was specific to that theater in that town in San Francisco. It was the events were San Franciscan, the concerns, but that very specificity then allowed the play to have a real national impact. Same thing happened with Angels in America. Same thing happened, I mean, there's numerous other examples that, as
Color Purple.
Malamud said, all art has to have an address. And it's usually the thing that we, in the regional theater, shifting my hat backwards for a minute, have to contribute most to the national theater scene is what we do locally. Is the thing that is most takes on the texture and flavor of our community, because when that is deeply investigated, that actually pushes the national dialogue in a way that is really significant.
Do you end up in situations where there's work that you personally really would like to foster that can't happen at your institutions?
No.
No.
You feel you can do whatever you want.
Money. There is some extraordinary classical work that I am dying to do. The casts are so huge, and it's all about money. It's not about artistry, and it's not about skill.
There's definitely money issues about quantity at the public.
Yes.
I mean, the public is still underproducing. We still should be having literally a greater number of productions every year and production opportunities, and that's about money. But there's literally, and this is one of the great joys for me of being at the public, there is nothing that is standing in the way of producing the artists that I believe in most.
I feel the same way.
And that's fantastic.
I do feel like we're a little bit hamstrung by only having one space at Hartford Stage.
Sure, yeah.
And I do feel that, in addition to money, that actually space is a problem for us, and that we're probably the only theater represented here that only has one
We just
venue.
got our second space.
It's fantastic,
too. And it's a godsend. I don't think I could have stayed if we didn't get it.
And I would say there are pieces that I have personally been very enamored of that I've chosen not to produce.
Because you think your audience can't handle
Wouldn't
it?
go on a journey?
That's closer. When I first got there, there's a very seductive tendency to paint with too broad a brush a conservative community. And it's been a almost 6-year learning cycle of developing a more comprehensive view. There are, it's less about subject matter and it's more about point of entry. And I have an audience that when we deal with issues of cultural oppression, look for the way in that is a familiar window to an unfamiliar place. And that is sometimes the reverse of the way a writer chooses to enter subject matter.
But I think I know what you're talking about, and that sometimes like for instance, at Hartford Stage, we produced Top Dog, Underdog, and we did it in collaboration with the Steppenwolf and the Alley Theater in Dallas. It was a fantastic production.
And this is following
Amy
its
Morton.
Success in New York at
Following
Public and on Broadway.
Yeah, on Broadway. Pulitzer Prize-winning play. I was not prepared for the response from our audiences, that they were, many of them, enraged by it. And we got more letters and emails and phone calls.
And what were they enraged by?
Language. This is what they said. Language and Amy and her cast have particularly chosen to explore the sexual behavior of especially one of the characters in K. Todd Friedman's performance. And some people then came back and accused us that wasn't necessarily in the script, that was more a production choice, and that I should have intervened and put. And to me, it seemed completely consistent with the script. But I actually do think it was this discomfort with cultural oppression, and because the very next play was the world premiere of Edward Albee's Peter and Jerry. Again, both plays, that play ended with Zeus' story, and both of them ended in a brutal death. And we didn't have that kind of response to Edward's play. And I think maybe, is it because Edward is so venerable and known, and Susan Lloyd Parks is still emerging? Now, at the same time, I want to say that teachers, for many of them, Top Dog Underdog was their favorite play because their students that they were brought really identified and resonated with these characters. But we've just come to talk about it as we'll sometimes have what we call our walkout play. And that was our walkout play, and then we kind of embrace it as such and take great pride in it. But I know what you mean, and sometimes it's unexpected.
I just wonder, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute.
Yeah.
I want to know if it's race, I want to know if it's gender, I want to know if they just didn't like the play. A lot of people don't like that play. She's a wonderful writer. Believe me, I'm a big fan, but that play, people walked out who I very much respect on Broadway.
Right.
They didn't like the play.
I didn't see it on Broadway, but I can
So
tell
I
you.
wonder if I just hate to ever sell our audiences short or underestimate them. Sometimes they just say, this isn't for me.
And you know what? I think that was for many people. It wasn't for them, but for some people, it could have been very much an issue of race. We have a very segregated.
Oh, I know you do.
Community
Been there.
up there, and I think one of the great things about the theater, and I'm sure this is true in all of our local communities, is that the theater is a huge tool to bringing those communities together.
Absolutely.
And that's changing every year. Where our audiences are becoming increasingly more diverse, not the opposite way. So it's so exciting and encouraging.
Yep.
But once in a while, you push it too far, and you're going to get that.
Well, we're going to have to move to a break, but quickly I want to ask Susan, the Alliance was engaged in what was considered as initially a decade-long conversation, a dialogue about race under your predecessor, Kenny Leon. Right. Is that a dialogue that continues? Are you the beneficiary of that, and all is now merged?
It absolutely continues, and it continues in an incredibly fruitful way. I was, as a freelance director, I was directing Spinning into Butter at the Alliance Theater when I was announced as the new artistic director, and it was an interesting introduction to the community because audiences perceived that because the announcement was made just as the show was opening, that it reflected my choice for the community, and so there was a perception that the white girl from Chicago, this was how she was going to talk about race with Spinning into Butter.
Oh boy.
Which in fact Kenny had programmed and asked me to come direct long before he decided to leave the theater.
Kenny's choice.
It was Kenny's choice. But it was an interesting conversation because there was an absolute assumption that the race identity of the institution's leader was absolutely going to affect that dialogue.
And quickly, Oskar, for you, coming in and following George Wolfe.
Very complicated. George succeeded, I believe, in making the public the first major American cultural institution that could not be called a white institution anymore. And that was a terrific and I think historic achievement. And suddenly the artistic director is, let's really just add it on, white, straight guy from Minnesota.
Pile it on, Oskar.
Former hippie communist. It's different. And I think one of the real struggles that I have now and that I'll continue to have is making sure that we are not gravitationally pulling the public back towards the center. Back towards the mainstream of American cultural life, in the sense that mainstream is still dominated by white leadership and
male leadership
and
white male leadership.
Right.
Yep.
That's a complicated question too, but it's just
why?
Because because actually there is significant, as we see at this table, significant female leadership.
You think we are the tip of the iceberg? We are the iceberg.
Molly at Arena.
You can name them. I must tell you, there's a new study coming out in about a month. The numbers for women running major theaters, directing and writing on major stages, the numbers are not better than they were in 1985.
Really?
Yeah.
You know what? Let's hold that, and we'll come back to that in our second half. And now let's just take a moment and hear a few words about the other work of the American Theater Wing.
The American Theater Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. We stand for excellence, and we support education in the theater.
Best known for creating the Tony Award, our work reaches beyond Broadway and New York.
These seminar programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, are an unequal forum for discussions with today's most creative artists.
Downstage Center's in-depth interviews are heard on XM satellite radio. Our grant and scholarship programs support New York theater companies and theater students. And since we began, we have given away more than $2.5 million.
Our theater intern group helps young people who are just starting in their careers build a professional network.
And Springboard NYC is a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country.
All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free, on demand, from our website, americantheaterwing.org.
Now, let's return to the seminar.
We're looking at a scene from the musical The Color Purple, which had its world premiere at the Alliance Theater Company. The Color Purple is emblematic of many shows that we see in institutional theaters these days, in that it was produced in a not-for-profit setting with the support of commercial producers. Since the country's resident theaters were originally set up in counterpoint to commercial productions, I'd like to ask about how your company's experiences with commercial producers has or hasn't influenced your subsequent artistic choices. Susan, I'll start with you.
Color Purple was a fantastic example of synergy. Alice Walker wrote a story about Georgia once upon a time, and it's a novel that changed our understandings of novels. And we are a theater that is most concerned about shared theater for diverse people. And that story has a capacity to invite so many people into a culturally, regionally specific story and lead them to a universal sense of hope and wonder. So when the opportunity came to participate in the evolution of that novel to a theatrical work, it could not have been a happier marriage of not-for-profit mission and financially stabilizing commercial potential. Are they all like that? Would that they were. Would that they were.
But Emily, you mentioned 4 out of 5 of your shows this season coming to New York in one way or another.
Actually, I realize it's 3 out of 5.
But still,
yes.
that's a high
Washington.
number.
Yeah,
does there become an expectation that your shows succeed not on your own stage, but people see it as a greater success if they move elsewhere?
That's a really good question, one that we wrestle with. We never choose a play because it's going to move. We never expect that, but what we want to do is extend the life of the artistic work. So we're often, both for financial reasons, but also for the life of the work, it might be New York, it might be the Kennedy Center, it might be Seattle Rep, it might be Hartford State, it might be the Alliance. We're looking for partnerships around the country to extend the life of the work. Now, eventually, it's still the clear truth, I'm afraid, that for new plays especially, in order to be put into the national repertoire and to be able to be published and seen as a finished piece of work, it's usually not considered finished until it's had its New York premiere.
Still today.
It's still today true. Now, we just opened Radio Golf last week at our theater, and it's going to be on Broadway in a month. It's still in flux, it's still in process, even though August is no longer with us. And it will continue to be in flux and in progress until once it opens on Broadway, I think it's April 20th, then that text is frozen, and that's what will be published, and that's what's going to be put into the national repertoire and will be done all over the country. So we need to take all those things into consideration, but we chose the work because of our relationship with August.
Right.
And our audience is mad for him.
Sure.
And we wanted to help shepherd his last play in.
Oskar, at the public, There have obviously been phenomenal successes commercially coming out of the public, certainly Chorus Line, which is now back on Broadway. But it's also been suggested there have been times when the public moving work commercially hasn't been in the best interests of the institution. Coming into that organization, where do you sit in terms of commercial versus just producing for your stages?
Sure, it's actually pretty simple, which is I think both at the public, but I would say within the field as a whole, I think there is a real necessity for a stake to be put in the ground for the non-commercial nature of what the theater does.
Yes.
What has happened since the second Tuesday of November 1980, Reagan's election, is a shift in the cultural dialogue in the country that has gone so far to the right that the marketplace and the measure of value by the marketplace has become hegemonic, as we commonly say. It's almost impossible to talk about value in this culture separate from the market. And I think the time is really ripe to make a very passionate statement and an institutionally powerful statement that what we do is nonprofit. What we do is not about making money.
Absolutely.
And that there's a way of measuring value that has nothing to do with the marketplace. And that's actually the same function that the public libraries are supposed to serve. It's the same function, and we, of course, at the public are in the building that was the cornerstone of the New York Public Library. That's why it's the public theater. And that idea is something we've had a lot of practice at, fortunately, because we've spent the last 50 years giving away shows in the park, giving away 1,800 seats a night to people. And that idea, I mean, when we, last summer for me, that's the little sort of paradigm I'd love to, is we're doing Mother Courage and Her Children. We're doing one of the greatest plays of the century, an absolutely thrilling anti-war play, new version by Tony Kushner, directed by George Wolfe, with Meryl Streep and Kevin Kline, and we're giving it away every night. So you're not giving away something that is of reduced value. You're actually taking the highest value that we can do in the American theater and making that free. That, figuring out how to not only sustain that business model, but actually extend it further is, I think, one of the public's big missions over the next decade. Because, again, as Susan was saying with Color Purple, there are many examples where the blurring of the line between the commercial and the nonprofit produces something of value. There's no question. But if that becomes the primary or the dominant model of what success is within the nonprofit field, we're in real trouble. Serious
Death
trouble.
to the profession, actually.
And I think you can see aspects of that, in the sense that you can see ways that the audience demographic in many ways across the country is actually narrowing again. And you're finding that the theater's becoming more entrepreneurial often means actually depending more on earned income, depending more on commercial sources of income. I was actually feeling some nostalgia, Susan, when you were talking about the national foundations and who the national foundations support, and I was thinking, wow, I remember they when actually mattered, because what national foundations gave you was a significant source of your budget. I bet you it isn't anymore.
No,
it
it's not.
Used to be
and
a
it's
point.
Shrinking.
It's shrinking dramatically.
Well, that's true. Since the time I've been at Hartford Stage, I'm in my 9th season now. We've grown from a $5 million company to an $8 million company, and the contribution line is almost flat. Almost all of that has been with tickets.
There you go.
And it's one of the conversations that we have a lot among our team is, how are we measuring success? It can't always be by the number of tickets sold or the paid percentage capacity, even though that's what our boards like us to look at and measure. And sometimes, certainly that's great, and we love it when we can achieve that. But we really do want to keep focusing on what is mission fulfillment.
That's right.
And how have we served that writer, and how have we brought this emerging artist along, and what new audiences did we attract with this piece? But I have to say, too, on the other hand, some of the commercial partnerships that we've had at Hartford Stage over the last several years have been some of our more exciting risk-taking ventures. Lanford Wilson's Book of Days was a big epic play that we couldn't have afforded without Darryl Rolfe and Jack Fattel stepping in. Peter and Jerry, Everett Albee's new play, Liz McCann stepped in and helped us with that. Edgardo Mine, Alfred Uri's play, which was about the conflict between the Catholic and the Jewish communities in Papal Italy in the 19th century. Jane Harmon helped make that play happen, and it's exciting to me we have a new play coming up next year. It's by Jeremy Sams, based on a Herman Brock novel. Most people don't even know who Herman Brock is. And we've got help from a commercial producer on that. And I'm not even sure that piece is commercial.
Yeah, but you see, this is what's interesting, Mike. No question.
So it can work in the favor of...
I can make similar lists. I know. But you know what I think the problem we're going to find is?
Right.
That is something that is really a product of the last 10 or 12 years, this sort of sense of enhancement being not something that happens once every few years for a major musical.
Once every other year for us.
Yeah, but it's also happening on odder projects, smaller projects. You're finding it, again, like with the Alfred Urey project or the Lanford project. I absolutely don't believe that's going to be sustainable.
Because you think at some point it's going to dry out.
I think the commercial theater field is trying that out.
Right.
And I think the what is starting to happen is they're starting to realize it's not working. In other words, there are not commercially viable projects that are coming out of the majority of those kinds of enhancing experiments.
In fact, none of those plays have moved to New York yet.
Exactly.
I think Peter Cherry's coming next
once
year.
Once that field decides they're not going to make money off you, they're not going to give you money anymore. Now, that's not because they're doing anything wrong. It's because their job is to make a profit. They say that.
Which is a different mission than what our theaters are established for.
When you can no longer help it, and suddenly we have a hole, and suddenly you're in a situation where you've been able to produce some risky work because you've had some commercial partners alleviating the risk. What happens when those commercial partners?
But you know what? It's a constant search. So if it's not a commercial part, it's like Emily was saying. It's about getting that work around to a wider audience. And we have so many partners this year. Fences was being shared with Dallas Theater Center, and Portland Center Stage out in Oregon. Our Summer and Smoke was shared by Paper
I'm suggesting, Michael,
we can't survive. Our level of work, we cannot do what we used to do when Howard Sherman was at Hartford Stage. That level of production, large-scale classical work or adventurous new play, we can't do it without partners anymore. See, whether they be you guys around the table or the commercial
all I'd say is let's make a distinction between us guys around the table and commercial producers.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Let's actually, because and again, I struggle with this, and my particular struggle with the public is different than your particular one, but
because it's in your face all the time, probably.
But and also, well, there's a whole other thing, but the common denominator is what I suggest is that we really are in a transitional phase for the American nonprofit theater, that we are all actually in the process of creating with our practice a new business model of how this theater functions, and that we should really know that we're doing that, be smart about it not only in the short range but in the long range. And for example, one of the things that I feel like is so important about the public is to say, all right, we have a choice here. We can do what in many ways the public has done over the last decade or so, which is lean heavily on the part of our legacy that was about transferring chorus line to Broadway, about the idea that commercial success is not only some kind of imprimatur, but is actually a funding source for the theater. Or we can lean on the other side, which is giving away free tickets in the park, which is the idea that earned income and is not where we're going to live, and that is not going to be our business model, and that actually the core model should be something that's much more analogous to universities or to a public library, much more analogous to the idea that we have to find a way for the society to say, this is the people's possession, this culture, and we have to figure out how to get it to the people.
How
do we get it there?
And that is not simply accomplished through restructuring business models. That requires all of us as artists and as artist-leading institutions to completely chuck the paradigm of how our communities interact with our work. Because the traditional conventions of, we were talking earlier, simple conventions that have to do with start times of curtains have to be looked at, but much larger conventions as far as what level of participation are we offering our audience. Because the notion of static engagement doesn't play anymore. You know, we have evolved into a generation of creators, creators, and at the very least editors of creation through all of these other mediums, and yet we say come to the theater and have a static relationship with a work of art. And in our theater, we look every year to find those new ways in which our audience is central to the performance, and the days of post shows constituting audience engagement, I think, are past. We have to find ways for our communities to be working with us to build plays, to write plays, to interact with theater, I think in a completely new fashion. And that's not a financial paradigm. That's an ownership paradigm. And I think we're trying to reinvestigate the notion of who owns our theater.
But the community owns it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the community, I mean, like, just like
501c3?
You're not-for-profit corporations that are held as a public trust by a board of directors.
Right. I mean, I think that's what, I mean,
but
how do we make them
when I say to
take that
if I say to
ownership?
my audience, well, this is
Right.
what I think you ought to watch, and so here it is, and at the end of 2 hours, be on your way. I am not being a particularly good partner in that ownership.
Not being
hear
a
it,
good
but-
hostess either.
Yeah.
Right. But I also think on the reverse, Susan, some of those audiences are saying, take me on a journey, Susan, and I will follow you. And you,
Yes.
I bet there are a huge percentage of your subscribers that want to go where Susan Booth's going to lead them. And then there are other ones that maybe haven't gone to the theater that much and are going to be a little bit in and out. And I agree with you. All of us are, God knows, looking for ways that we can further engage our audiences. And I definitely think it should never be a static relationship, because that feels so much like a movie or a TV event, and we don't want to ever be like that. We want actors spitting in the audience's faces, right? I mean, we want to remind them that this is live and communal, and I think it sounds like your staff is really onto that.
You know, I guess I just would not also get too smart about this. Ticket prices is a huge issue.
Oh,
It's a huge issue.
Huge issue.
Bingo.
But I think it's a balance, Oskar. I mean, I love how you're talking about it. I mean, since the 80s, we're seeing huge problems, and again, since Bush came into office, we're losing foundation support because they are going to have to give to education, they're having to give to health, they're having to give to elder care, because the government is no longer being destroyed, basically. So the first thing to go often is the arts, and just when that kind of nourishment is needed for young people in schools, who's doing it? We're going into the schools in the state of New Jersey, as are other wonderful theater companies in the state, to give young people an outlet. We're the ones, we're finding ways to continue our mission and take up the slack that used to be taken by government. So we're losing foundations. We're finding, but they're getting tapped out more and more, is that more individuals are coming up to the plate, just as they do for universities. They say, my goodness, this is a lifeblood for our community, for our young people, for
But that's
people are now retiring to Princeton because they want to see what's going on at this theater and our Performing Arts Center. But
what's exciting about that is that that's such a reflection of the people in your community. If they're giving more through the individuals,
they
really do own that theater.
Oh yeah,
and they
totally
value it,
do.
and they say we want to sustain that
and
level.
it is, in fact, a big community.
That's
I mean,
a good.
Since I arrived, for example, we've had a building and growing wonderful relationship with the different African American communities around the area, and so, it was so much fun when on Radio Golf, when first preview, it was almost 40% of the house was African American, and Jack Vertel said, "How did you do this?" And the thing is, you go to the churches, you go to the social groups, it's been 17 years of cultivating real deep personal relationships with different leaders and people in the community, and it comes back and back and back, and it's very exciting to have a community that loves the theater and that wants to come and be engaged and knows that they can come and stay and talk and discuss what's going on. At the same time, I mean, I hear Oskar, and my idealism again gets rekindled, not as if it ever died, but what are we going to do about ticket prices? What are we going to do about keeping ourselves, not pricing ourselves out of the market of the people who we want to be communicating with? And it's interesting, people saying, oh, well, there are no new young audiences. We're finding that we've come up 15% on young audiences in the last year.
Don't you think?
Actually, less price sensitive than I would have thought. And have a 23-year-old, and sort of grilled him yesterday about this, and as he said, I'll go to something you tell me not only is really good, but I will like, or word of mouth of my friends, or it's on a blog, or it's somewhere. I'm not just going to go to the theater and spend 20, 25, 30 bucks.
But I think most of us cultivate that audience through a reduced ticket price.
We do it through a reduced ticket price, but then there's those 20-somethings that are not students.
Right.
I mean, they're the ones more, the early 30s, they may have a job where they can...
They'll drop 100 plus for a rock concert or something.
But we're finding that we're doing a reduced price also for their 20-somethings because they're the ones that are caught in the middle of it all. I don't know if you're doing that too, but...
Oh, we absolutely are, and we have college reviewers that post are posting their response to the work that they see.
Right.
And in response to the number of postings, they get reduced ticket prices,
yes,
that
exactly.
kind of thing.
We're doing all of this too. But it's a cultural seismic shift, I think, that we have to be looking at too, that people are getting their entertainment information from different places now. I can't think of a younger group that reads the paper for it, and much of it is blogging, much of it's on the web. So we're looking at that.
I want to jump in because we're talking now about young audiences. I want to come back to the institutional roles in developing young artists. And interestingly, Emily, you made the comment in the first half about women artistic directors, saying that you and Susan are not the tip of the iceberg, but are the iceberg.
Well, there are a few more of us, but
what are the roles that you can play at, admittedly, some of the larger institutions in the country at fostering the next generation and really diversifying the artist pool in America?
I think there's two issues in terms of female artists coming up. We have to make our workplaces family friendly. The notion that the rehearsal hall and the theater proper is not family friendly just is repugnant to me. And so that's a big part of it because it cannot be a choice. There are so many women who were on a track to run institutions and stepped out or made a decision not to have children.
That's right.
And that has to be. Institutions have to pay attention to that. They absolutely have to pay attention to that. In terms of young artists, I think one of the things that I would say all four of these theaters do is we offer young artists productions, not simply workshops and readings, but productions.
That's right.
And I think that there's a big difference between offering somebody a commission and offering somebody a staged reading at your institution. One of the things that I take great pride in is at the time that Marcia Norman was on our stage as the book writer for Color Purple, one of her Juilliard students was the next show up.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of support for young writers I think is critical. I think we all do it.
We all do it.
We're just instituting right now a new program in one of our theaters, the Shiva. We're putting up a play called In Darfur, which a wonderful young writer named Winter Miller wrote after she went to Darfur less than a year ago, 8 months ago, 10 months ago now. And part of what we're trying, and that show will be performing 2 weeks from now, and part of what we're trying to do is get a rotating model going in the Shiva where when we're fully functioning, that we will have a new play running there every month, year-round. So that 3-week run, 1 week turnaround, 3-week 1 week turnaround. We're starting with a $15 ticket price. It is my fervent hope to get that ticket price to $0 by a year from now.
Wow.
So it's also about a different audience. But part of what we're trying to do is just increase the quantity of opportunities available so that, among other things, just lower the bar on how good a play has to be before you can put it in front of an audience. Lower the bar on how quickly you can just respond to an event, or again, the sort of thing I'd said when I got on the phone to raise the money so we could do the Darfur project is, shouldn't we do a play in the American theater about a genocide that isn't 5 years afterwards, and the fundamental theme being the great sense of guilt and regret we feel about what we failed to do about the last genocide? What if we actually are able to put a play up at a time when we can still do something? So to talk about audience involvement, we're partnering with SaveDarfur.org and a couple of other organizations who actually want to be nameless because they don't want to draw attention to their activities in Darfur, where when the audience walks out of the theater, there are going to be wireless stations where they can directly contact their congresspeople. There are going to be telephones and postcards so that we can directly involve in the divestment campaign in the Sudan. And that sense of trying to make the theater a place where not only you experience play, but you actually engage in social
And
activism.
it's catalytic.
Right.
Exactly. I mean,
Well, that goes back to extending the
Right. It's longer than
activities
2
beyond
hours.
the front lines.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think in addition to all these opportunities for the artists that may be freelance coming in for these extraordinary programs that Oskar and Susan were talking about, I think also within our staffs, Hartford Stage has, for instance, a rich history. Irene Lewis was Paul Widener's associate, and then she went on to run a theater. Tracy Brigden was my associate. Now she's running City Theater in Pittsburgh, and I think that is the role that all of our theaters, Peter Dubois on your staff, and Mara and others on yours.
Loretta.
Loretta Greco came.
My first intern.
Merged. Oh my goodness. And I think sometimes that we don't talk about that enough, as that these
The
artistic
mentorships.
homes and the mentorships, and that really is the future leadership. And also this TCG program of the mentor-mentee program has been fantastic. Eric Ting at Long Wharf Theater has come out of Gordon's mentorship there and is going great guns. And Hannah Sharif is this fantastic young African-American woman that is going to, I think, really take the American theater by storm. And she's been with us for the last 2 years. And I'm very grateful to TCG for helping channel NEA money
Yes, we've
to
done
that.
that too. We have it
Since
too.
we don't really have large money from the NEA anymore, I think just to, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but most of these companies sitting around the table used to get $300,000 from the NEA, and I would bet most of us are getting $30,000 a year or so. And that's a huge discrepancy. That's a lot of lunches or a lot of tickets to sell to
That's
fill.
not adjusting for inflation either.
And money for innovation is hard money to come by. Do you know, we have a national graduate playwriting competition where we invite final year MFA students to submit work, and the winning script gets a full production on our stage the following year. That is completely funded by an anonymous donor, and it's an institutional imperative now. We had taken that competition to a number of national funders and did not see support for it.
You will not. No.
But what these guys are talking about is also something that I think it's not just a question of us talking about it more, Michael. I think that by talking about it more, we can hopefully take more responsibility for it as a field.
Right.
I actually don't think as a field we are taking enough responsibility for training our successors, and for by answering the question of which young artists are we investing in. And I'm sensitive to this issue of artistic leaders, directors, and people who are on the track to run these institutions. By making that choice, we are defining the future of American theater.
Absolutely. It's a very serious responsibility.
As all of us have at various points been up for jobs or sat on panels, selecting other people for jobs, we actually know the people who are qualified to run the major nonprofit theaters is a tiny pool, and it is not something you can come out of nowhere to do. It's actually it's a field as complicated as medicine, and the degree of hands-on experience and training you need to be eligible to run one of these can only be given to you by us, by the people who are
apprenticeships.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're holding up a sign that says goodbye.
I hate to slam the brakes on this, but this discussion has been terrific in just showing the breadth of issues that you deal with on a day-to-day basis in the very complicated role of being artistic directors. And we thank you for being with us.
Yes.
Thank you also for joining us. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in partnership with our friends at CUNY TV. On behalf of the American Theater Wing, thanks for joining us for another edition of Working in the Theater.